Welcome, and thank you for joining the New America Fellows Program for a discussion with Atossa Abrahamian's The Hidden Globe. I'm Ben Mock, 2024 New America Fellow. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function in the box next to the video, and we'll get to them in the second half of the event. And more importantly, copies of The Hidden Globe are available for pre-order through our book-selling partner, Solid State Books. You can find a link to buy the book on the event page and just click Buy the Book. Atossa Abrahamian, class of 2024 New America Fellow, is an independent journalist who writes about the cracks in the nation-state system. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, the London Review of Books, and other publications. The author of The Cosmopolites, The Coming of the Global Citizen. She has worked as an editor at The Nation, an opinion editor at Al Jazeera America, and a reporter for Reuters. She grew up in Geneva and lives in Brooklyn. Abrahamian's first book, The Cosmopolites, The Coming of the Global Citizen, investigated the multi-billion-dollar market for passports, interrogating what the sale of citizenship means for nomadic billionaires, the stateless poor, and everybody else. Her second book, The Hidden Globe, published this month by Riverhead, examines the jurisdictions above, between, and beneath nations. Combining reporting, criticism, metaphysics, and legal theory, it leads readers through the special economic zones that prop up world trade, the polar archipelagos that challenge the definition of national sovereignty, the ships crisscrossing the world, flying flags of convenience, and the microstates rewriting the laws of outer space. Hi, Atossa.
Hey, Ben,
Thanks.
thank you for doing this.
Nice to chat with you. So both of your books are concerned with the ways in which I would describe them as concerned with the ways in which markets manage to emerge around, or one might say co-opt or exploit, concepts and features of the world that we don't usually think of as being for sale. And in your first book, that central object was citizenship. And in this book, it takes the form of sovereignty, forms of financial and legal immunity, borders themselves, and of course, outer space. I'm curious whether, and if so, how this book emerged out of your last one, whether you think of them as part of a larger project of investigating these avant-garde markets, if the first book inspired this one, what was the connection?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a very pithy summary. So when I was reporting my first book, which was 10 years ago, believe it or not, I spent a lot of time with passport brokers. So people who go around the world and they talk governments into selling their citizenship. And then these governments will pitch it to investors the same way that they would pitch, same way any salesman would pitch anything. And that really struck me because I personally never felt like citizenship was terribly meaningful to me. But I also saw around me that people found it very meaningful to them. And so to have this a head of state, right, someone who's supposed to represent the country in every meaningful way, come out and say, actually, like all of our national myths and traditions and all the things that make us who we are may very very well exist, but we're also going to sell it to you for $250,000 or $50,000 or what have you. So that was really striking. In the reporting of that book, I also spent time around a lot of like tax attorneys and consultants and people who are adjacent to this world, whether they were doing background checks for applicants of these citizenship by investment schemes, or if they were working for the passport brokers themselves. And I noticed that a lot of these types but they never talked about countries. They always talked about jurisdictions. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like, why? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they saw the world in a very different way. Rather than identifying the country of St. Kitts and Nevis and the nation state of Malta, they would see the jurisdiction of Malta, the jurisdiction of St. Kitts and Nevis, along with everything that these jurisdictions offered an outsider and all of the limits on what they could offer. So something that I remember really clearly from this time is I was trying to get a green card and I was talking to a citizenship consultant and tax attorney. And I was telling him about my problems. I was like, oh, it's so annoying, like takes so long. I wish I had my green card so I could be done with this. And he looked at me like shocked and he said, but why would you want to do that? They tax you for life. And so that's an example of a jurisdiction, right? Where whether you're in the US or not, you are stuck at the very least filing your taxes with the IRS. And it's a way in which the US American power goes beyond its borders in even the most mundane ways. So that kind of led me to thinking, well, how else is this world? What else do these people see? Because they're seeing passports where Malta is and where St. Kitts is and where Dominica is. But what else is there? And it turned out that there were a whole bunch of different things that they saw with their, goggles. And these include special economic zones. They include free ports. As you mentioned, it includes address space, flags of convenience, which is a ship's version of a passport by investment, and a whole bunch of other loopholes that the book talks about. So I think there's a pretty straight line between book one and book two, but this one was a lot longer and more complicated to report because passports are a little more tangible than systems of law that don't really belong anywhere in particular.
Yeah, and the scope of this book is just vast. It crosses the entire world. It goes from Australia to the Arctic Circle. I can imagine it took a little bit longer to put together.
Yeah,
Um,
the first one took about 6 months all told. Apart from the thinking took a lifetime. It always does. And this one took like 5 years. So yeah.
uh, both of these, both of your books, but maybe particularly this one, do have you mentioned your own kind of green card troubles. They both describe personal connections that you have to these subjects, both your panoply of citizenships in the first case, but here you talk about growing up in Geneva and how growing up in Geneva kind of gave you a very particular, unusual um, point of view for talking about these extra fluid conduits for money and capital that appear throughout the book, sometimes under a kind of conceptual umbrella of Switzerland. Um, so could you maybe expand on this idea of Geneva? In your book, you describe it as a city of holes. And I think that's sort of an important metaphor wherever you go in the book.
Yeah, for all of its history, and I should be clear, Geneva started its kind of life as an entity, as a city state, not as a part of Switzerland. It joined later. Um, and it's for most of its history, it's been an entrepot, right? It's been a marketplace. It's been a place where goods and people and money go through, mainly because it's landlocked, but along a couple of rivers. So, there are pathways to other places, but also because Geneva, I guess, managed to survive as an entity and not be subsumed by like the warring monarchs next door by making itself very useful to them. And whether that was by providing well, Geneva didn't have mercenaries. The other cantons had mercenaries, mercenary trade, which they would train soldiers and send them abroad to fight in conflicts that they had nothing to do with, um, just hired guns. Geneva actually took this concept further, and instead of war, they sent bankers, and they provided bankers and financial services for example, the French crown. And I see this as an extension of the mercenary model. And if you fast forward to today, we have almost mercenary figures in the legal world, acting as judges in commercial courts. So these are people who are trained by one jurisdiction or country or however you see it, and then they go off into the world and they kind of peddle whatever they have to offer, to other states. Um, Geneva, on the one hand, Geneva was a place where money and goods went through. It was also a city of refuge, right? It was a haven for Protestants, when they were not welcome anywhere else. It was also one of the centers of the Protestant Reformation, which we can talk about. But in addition to being a haven for goods and money, it was a haven for certain types of people. And what I think is interesting is that it has maintained this kind of ethos. It's definitely not the world's, weary and poor. It's a refuge for pretty shady characters. One of the people in my high school was Saddam Hussein's nephew, and no, like, not to say anything about this then child, right? But like, Geneva will provide any number of shifty people with a sanctuary, whether they're foreign dictators or money launderers or crypto bros or most recently Pavel Durov, the guy who started Telegram. His estranged ex-wife lives in Geneva, I recently learned, which is not surprising at all. Um, and so when you walk around Geneva, you see this wealth. I mean, it's astonishing. The cars, the houses, it's nuts. It's also very clean. I mean, it's really lovely in that respect. Um, and so you have all of this wealth, some of it ill-gotten, and at the same time, you have all of these do-gooder institutions, the UN, the WHO, any kind of international organization you can think of has headquarters, or if not headquarters, a branch in Geneva. And so part of what I was trying to do with this book is square that. Like, how can this be a city of refuge for money and dictators and also be a place where the Geneva Conventions come from? Like, how can you take the money of someone who's doing torture while also being the seat of a convention against torture? And I don't think that I've cracked it, other than saying this is the world we live in, and Geneva is a really concentrated version of that. Um, but I think that the city of Geneva has kind of kept up its ways for a very long time, and we can learn a lot by looking at it.
Thanks. Yeah, the capsule histories throughout your book investigating these interesting places, but also kind of concepts themselves are really fascinating. I think I would say that there's these ideas like the citizen or the soldier or the ship or the state's ability to tax its citizens that are presented to us in everyday conversation like they're immutable and eternal concepts that they came down on tablets from the mountain. But in these histories, you reveal to the reader that many of them are quite modern, and that in fact. Even the idea that they're as old as the Treaty of Westphalia is sort of itself a fiction. You quote a historian who writes that nationalism kind of rewired our collective imagination into believing that this idea of one land, one people, one government has been the normal way of doing things for 400 years, when in fact we have to approach the end of colonialism to even see that presented as a theory or as an idea in much of the world. So it's interesting. You have your book has a lot of interviews with people who are kind of architects of these new way of doing things. Some of whom seem very savvy about this. The difference between sovereignty and jurisdiction, or between between these immutable concepts and what a legal expert would understand. Um, I wonder, how often did you get the sense that the people you were interviewing, and not just also critiques of the system, like John Siegler, who you interview early in the book, how often did you feel like people were kind of fully savvy or fully in belief of the essentially fictional nature of things like state sovereignty and borders, or do you think the subjects of this book kind of have this idea that these are real concepts that are corrupted and that retain a kind of legitimacy in a pure form, if that makes sense as a question?
Yeah, I think both can be true at once. Like, just to go back to the passports, like, I see that many people put a great deal of importance in their citizenship while also maybe selling it, right? And I think that these two things are like in conflict, but like not mutually exclusive, because of the pressures of global capitalism. Um, and the people I spoke to, it was interesting. A lot of them had a moment where like the scales kind of fell from their eyes and they saw the world for what it was and nothing was the same. Um, and I think that this kind of revelation, if you want to call it, gave them an opportunity to pursue their line of work or to further it. But another thing I noticed is that these kind of quote unquote Westphalian notions of like what the state, what the nation state does, that's also really Western, right? Like in the UAE, for example, nobody is offended by the idea of a free port or a special economic zone. It's just not, I guess the imagination isn't wired in quite the same way as like in France or the US or in a place where you're hearing a lot of America First type discourse. So it's also pretty culturally specific, and I had to get up to speed on that as well. Um, but yeah, I mean the short answer is like both of these things exist in our world, and I think that the winners um, have multiple balls in the air and kind of are able to keep these things in tension without having one explode the other.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the Freeport, which is one of the stars of your book, I'd say, or one of a kind of recurring character as a concept, which overlaps with the special economic zone and the free trade zone. These zones that act differently, that ostensibly are different from normal space within a nation state, within a territory under administration. And about one of the architects of the modern Freeport, I'm not sure if you'd use that term, but a rebrander, you say, of the modern Freeport. You wrote that he understands, one of his gifts was that he understood what the rich want, which is technology, exclusivity, walls, doors. What they definitely don't want, in my experience, is scrutiny and publicity. So I want to ask some kind of like nuts and bolts questions about writing this book. How did you approach people who might be suspicious of your intentions, especially given that you're a journalist? People can look up your work and kind of glean maybe your skepticism of some of these places and people. How did you get access? How did you approach?
Yeah, 50% of the time I spoke to people who no one had really taken an interest in before. And so it was a mix of like genuine, like, oh, I finally there's someone I can talk to about these things I've been thinking of for years and years on both sides, right? Because like while I may not agree with some of the people in the book, it was just a pleasure to speak to someone about the stuff that I had been sitting on my couch thinking about for the whole pandemic. Um, and then so that I'd say that's about half of them, and I mean, I was pretty upfront about what I was trying to do, and I think I stuck to that. I haven't gotten too many complaints yet. Um, there's also an element of, well, I guess a faction or a sub-faction of people who are really outwardly libertarians, who are very into free markets, who don't share the political beliefs that I have expressed quite openly in the past, and continue to do so. And in that case, um, well, there many of them were libertarians, and so I kind of said, well, look, like we disagree on a lot of things, but like you're an open-minded guy, like I am an open-minded person, like maybe we can talk this through. And I actually found those conversations to be there was, I mean, so what I'm trying to say is like there was a bit of convincing. But it wasn't as hard as you think because generally speaking, I think people are pretty intellectually curious and open-minded, and I was
Mhm.
really pleasantly surprised by that. But in the case of the Freeport King, Yves Bouvier, who you mentioned, that was pure luck. I went to an event at a bookstore in Geneva. It was actually a book about him and his
Right. It's the scene that's in the book, right?
yeah, the scenes in the
Yeah.
book. I went to this bookstore thinking I was going to meet the author and like maybe like have a chat, and then who shows up but Yves Bouvier and his entourage of lawyers. So, and then that was easy. I just talked to him and he gave me his number. So there was some serendipity for sure as well.
Cool. Cool. And of course, many of the interview subjects are quite proud of their creations, such that they would happily speak to you. And I do that. I'm thinking of, is it Mark Beer, the kind of architect of this interesting kind of court system in Dubai, who was very genial. And I have to say, you strike the book is not a polemic. It's not a Jeremiah. It strikes a tone of kind of skeptical curiosity, but we never feel like there's a gotcha moment with any of these interviews, and maybe that's something um, that comes across in the way that you kind of approach subjects or in the way that you discuss these things as an object of as an object of interest, you know, an interesting subject to write about, regardless of your opinions. And of course, I imagine you can also appeal to the marketplace of ideas, right?
Yeah, I again, it was a lot of this was done during COVID, and I wouldn't discount the fact that people were a little desperate for like human connection. So, that worked to my advantage. And I mean, I really wasn't looking to catch it. There's plenty of blame to go around, but I don't think that it makes sense to like point fingers at these guys. We're all complicit in this world, and they happen to be on the more planning side of it. But I mean, in some cases, they're even denouncing the stuff that they participated in. The character who talked at length about his work in the special economic zone world started off as someone on the political right who was, really interested in the business of these exceptions because he grew up in one. He grew up between Mauritius and Réunion, which is a French department, but very far from France, very far from metropolitan France. And so he had this innate sense that like maybe territory and law don't go together and maybe we can separate these things. And sure enough, he went on to be a pretty big deal in the special economic zone world. But then he soured on the whole thing because he noticed that these carve outs were being almost assigned or prescribed to countries that were trying to develop their economies. And he didn't see it going all that well. The biggest surprise of that chapter is I expected a lot more. I expected a lot more people to defend the line of work they're in, but pretty much everyone I talked to who is in the business of SEZs, who I had, substantial conversations with, essentially said these things don't work as well as they thought they would. And they were trying to think of ways to make them work better. And I thought that was really curious because how often do you get these consultant managerial types essentially saying, yeah, no, this business model isn't really so great. And we should, maybe think of something more. So that was really, really a surprise.
That is interesting. And you and I have both written a bit on special economic zones in different parts of the world. I wonder what they mean by working better. What would it mean to them to work better? You know, when I have reported on these objects, they are often sold as structures that will locally enrich the population, that they'll be job creators, that they will be that they will spark innovation in often areas that struggle economically or that are kind of backwaters, far from not this is universally true, but often far from the metropole. Um, is it something like that where they would do these things that they are advertised as doing, but rarely in practice do?
Yeah, the idea at the really basic level is that you designate a part of a country, have more business-friendly laws, and in a lot of the case that means lower taxes. Maybe you have some immigration, streamlining the immigration process to import workers or to hire foreign workers, even though these are supposed to employ local population, right? Sometimes the zone will have, if you're really taking it as far as like the UAE, maybe there would be different law, even different legal systems. But the basic idea is you're just going to make it easier for foreign business to function. And this is going to have a trickle down effect on the rest of the country. What, and and so if you talk to economists who are for this and who have thought through it, they will say, okay, but that works only if you're bringing ideas and innovation and infrastructure, investing in infrastructure from abroad, in a way that you wouldn't be able to do as quickly just from doing it from home. And so it's almost like you're speeding up something that would have already happened and bringing in more money. But a lot of the time, you'll give a company a tax holiday. And I love that they call it a tax holiday because there's not even a pretension that they're going to stay, right? It's like 20 years and then you can do whatever you want. They'll come, they'll benefit from the lower taxes, they'll benefit from the cheaper labor, and maybe the amount of investment in local economies or infrastructure, building roads, that really basic stuff doesn't happen to the degree that it's supposed to. So let's say a company comes in and 10 years later, yeah, maybe there's a road, but not much more. Like that's not really, and then they leave, you're not really gaining a whole lot. Like you'll have employed people for a few years, but then there's the downside where maybe you're not paying into the National Insurance Fund or whatever social programs that the company would have otherwise had to pay into. So it really ends up being a bit of a giveaway for the private sector. There's a way to manage this and to hold them more accountable and to require more of them, but historically that just hasn't happened. Um, and there are many reasons why, and I think those really vary from place to place. The funny thing is about all of these zones is like each one, like they're all special snowflakes, right? They might have been conceived under the same broad umbrella, but where they are and who runs them still matters. So it's really case by case, but for the most part, there was just a big explosion of these zones, between the 70s and the 90s. And I don't think anyone could say that these are an unmitigated success.
Sure. I'm going to remind viewers that you should please write out any questions you have for Atossa in the chat box that you should see on your screen, and I will devote the last 20 minutes or so to reader/viewer questions. Let's talk a little bit about space law, because that was a highlight of the book for me, kind of one of the more fanciful chapters, certainly something I haven't really read about before. It's described as the ultimate offshore location, offshore. And among the kind of interesting phenomena you describe happening jurisdictionally in space is Luxembourg establishing its own space agency despite having no launch pads and until recently no university, in order to help corporate entities do asteroid mining. And another one is the small island nation of Tonga, which, correct me if I'm wrong, has kind of managed to procure or reserve certain equatorial satellite space, which is in limited supply, using a kind of piece of space legislation. So I'm interested to hear how you worked your way into this subject, and also maybe as a follow-up, how you chose. I mean, there's so many examples. I mean, I know the problem of having so many case studies and so many ideas you want to fit into a book, having to choose which ones are the most salient, how to structure your book around a kind of capacious, in my case, I might say baggy. In your case, let's say capacious idea, that in your case, luckily included asteroid mining and space law.
Yeah, the origin of this, my little obsession with asteroid mining, I remember exactly when it started. I was sitting at my desk at Al Jazeera and they were winding down. Basically we all knew we were going to be out of a job soon. And I read an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by a lawyer who was also he was a lobbyist also. And it was talking about how he was writing nice things about an analogous piece of legislation in the US called the Space Act. And the Space Act does something very interesting. It recognizes private property in space. This is interesting because there aren't any countries or there's no sovereignty of which we are familiar with in space. You can't claim territory. You can't impose you can't have a court. None of the things that we take for granted on Earth exist in space. Definitely not even gravity. Like it's just a completely like none of our metaphors make sense in space. Like it's just a completely different topsy-turvy world, kind of a blank slate, but also not, because what do we have but countries beginning to make laws for outer space? The reason countries can't claim space as their own is because at the UN level, there were a bunch of treaties in the 60s and 70s, mostly intended to ensure that there wouldn't be war and not peaceful uses of outer space. And in signing those treaties, um, countries agree, well, the signatories to these treaties agreed that they wouldn't claim it, right? So space has to be for the benefit of mankind. Um, but at the time, there weren't really any Elon Musks hanging around the UN, and people weren't really thinking about what would happen if somebody wanted to mine an asteroid or find gold or water on the moon. At least that wasn't the main conversation. There were people at the UN, there were delegates, like the delegate from Peru, who had these unbelievably eloquent and forward-thinking statements about what would happen if they didn't make a bigger stink about this possibility. But nobody listened to them. And fast forward, 40 years, and we have people talking about expanding the economy into space and using space resources for moon colonies and Mars colonies and whatnot. And all of that rests on something very simple, which is that to have anything at all, someone has to recognize it as property, as your property or somebody else's property. And the only way we have to do that is through laws on Earth. It's a very long-winded way of saying I read this op-ed that was saying that the US recognizing outer space property for US citizens was revolutionary, and it was going to like be so good for space exploration and rocket companies and whatnot. And then I noticed a headline that Luxembourg was looking into the same thing. But curiously, they weren't just looking to recognize the property rights in space of Luxembourg citizens, who are not very numerous, but they would be opening up this option to anyone who had had a company in Luxembourg. And so for me, my antennas just went off because I have been thinking for a long time about letterbox firms and tax havens and ways that companies and people too can pretend they're in one place without being there, and the sort of legal fiction of residence and corporate personality. And this was like a perfect combination of this, where Luxembourg for a century has been a hotspot for letterbox firms and holding companies and other ways to kind of circumvent other rules. And now it was doing it in this like completely brazen and like honestly hilarious way, by offering up these same products for space miners. Um, and the reporting for this was really fun because the Luxembourgeois were they wanted to tell the world about their new space laws, and they trotted out the hereditary Grand Duke and Duchess of their country to go and speak to all these nerds on the West Coast. And they invited journalists. They were game, like they really wanted the coverage. So I went along, watched them, make these speeches. They had a very charismatic and funny deputy prime minister at the time who was also really into this stuff. And so and it was obvious. I mean, this was obviously, the story, right? Because it's a grand duchy with an actual hereditary grand duke. And then when I started looking at I actually learned about the almost prehistory of this stuff when I was writing an article for The Guardian about the Luxembourg stuff. But in that, I read a lot about telecommunications. A lot of it's really dry, and I'm not going to repeat it all, but it turns out that Luxembourg was not the first small country to try to like arbitrage space law. And the island nation of Tonga had actually done this before. There were asteroid miners, there were satellite companies, and kind of basically the way there's some very good parking spaces for satellites. And because of almost a quirk in international telecommunications regulation, any country could put in for these spots, even if they didn't have any kind of infrastructure to use them. And it wasn't just the government, the King of Tonga or the Princess of Tonga acting on their own kind of instinct. They were talked into it by an American entrepreneur from California. So in both cases, actually, there's this exchange between Californians and small countries, and you can call it exploitative or mutually beneficial. That's up for grabs. But space has always been an arena for these kinds of ambitions.
Hmm. Uh, yeah, and your book is quite concerned, or at least it comes up quite a bit, the kind of pairing of a lack of natural resources, a lack of kind of conventional exploitable resources, um, in a sovereignty and efforts to kind of innovate one's way to wealth. In doing so, there are often references. I'm thinking also kind of my own reporting in spaces like this. Everybody talks about Dubai. Dubai is kind of a metaphor. And I think in your book, Geneva also serves not just as a space, but as a kind of metaphor that people, maybe now, you know, people also talk about Singapore. But for me, whenever I've gone to on a reporting trip to a place that had some kind of economic innovation or kind of like dreams of grandeur or escaping kind of the economic limitations of being a petro state or a client state in some way. It's typically Dubai, which is kind of this dream vision. Yeah, and of course you devote some time in your book to Dubai as well. I guess I just think I wonder if you also encountered this kind of interesting use of symbolism. I don't know if this feels like something that is like kind of post-national. Obviously, like it seems like there might have been a time when sovereignties wanted to kind of imitate or duplicate the rise of nations, but now it is kind of these extraterritorial spaces that are that sort of form the matter out of which these dreams of wealth and security and independence arise.
Yeah, I mean, Dubai's leaned into this so hard. Their whole identity, when I went to visit a few years ago, it seemed the whole identity of the emirate was like around the future. And there's something really, I mean, you get drawn in. It's really impressive. Like you go to a mall and there's a montage of like all the wonderful futuristic things they're doing. And it's really interesting. And I guess when I was there, it occurred to me that like um I think they've hired lots of really smart, like intellectuals who maybe can't find a job anywhere else except working for Dubai and prognosticating about like what the future is and what the future means and how to participate in it. But anyway, but putting that aside, another thought I had when I was thinking about Dubai as a brand or Dubai as sort of an imagined city is I kept thinking back to Calvino's Invisible Cities and how they all represent some kind of dream or fantasy or positive or negative. And that would, I mean, you could just write a chapter in the style of Calvino about Dubai.
Sure.
But more poetic than I am could do that. Um, Anyway, I forgot your question, Ben, but yes, I think that this not only when you watch this in action, when you go to the Dubai, the fairs that they put on, or you talk to the people that are, pitching this vision, or you even just look at their posters and see how they've designed things, you can see how for a government that hasn't really been able to get bring in the kind of investment they might want, whether it's for purely mercenary purposes or to like improve the lot of their population, you can see how this is a really appealing version of what can be. Because I mean, it's very distinctly not talking a big game about democracy and freedom and participation and the values that a place like the US purports to upholding.
Mhm.
It's something very different. It's something a lot more directed, something a lot more commercial. And I think that can be quite appealing when the world feels like it's falling apart.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I have more questions, but why don't we go to the audience questions and you can feel free to keep asking those, and I will see them and we'll take as many as we can. Uh, so we have a question from Irina Asmudson, which reads, given the need for big climate financing, how can we direct this money to the intended targets rather than reinforcing existing patterns? Um, so
I'm
maybe
not
how can some of the money that's being diverted maybe from tax revenue through these kind of extraterritorial, these avant-garde markets, maybe how can they be directed toward um, the required infrastructure and kind of maybe climate-related energy projects um, that we need?
Mm. Yeah, I think that before we talk about how to get the money and where to send it, there has to be more of a political will to invest in this stuff, and I don't think we're there yet. So I think that like, yeah, we're gonna have to figure out how to pay for all the climate infrastructure, but we're a bit putting the cart before the horse because currently it doesn't seem like anyone is particularly motivated to do that, except if you're talking about like, I don't know, carbon capture, like investing in
Hmm.
you know, and I'm not an expert in the climate stuff. I'm afraid it's a weak point of mine, but you can if you want to take this concept of a special zone really, really, really expansively, like nature preserves are types of special zones, like protected reefs are types of special zones. You can envision a, a world where you have much more of that. And I don't know that it would be a special economic, like maybe there would be economic incentives for doing that. And I think in some cases there are. But maybe that can be part of the solution. And that might be a palatable way to present it because we already have SEZs, we already have these types of structures. And I don't know how far this can go science-wise, but like maybe it's a way to spin it in a way that's palatable, not only to states, but to institutions like the World Bank or the IMF that are going to be participating in the financing and the planning too.
Sure. I had actually a similar question for you, not about climate, but I in addition to writing about subjects that are, I would say, fun and have a certain element of fancifulness about them, like asteroid mining, you also write about kind of victims of these legal fictions. One of whom is this guy Abdul Aziz Mohammed, who was an asylum seeker from Sudan, who was imprisoned on Manus Island for most of his 20s. Had committed no crime, was just seeking political asylum. And he eventually managed to arrive in Geneva, and you write that he kind of traveled from one side of the hidden globe to the other. But on Manus Island, he was kind of on one of these spaces that Australia excised in order to get away with human rights abuses, and skirt both its own national laws and then international laws. Um, and those cases strike me as pretty hopeless seeming. And my question, which maybe has the same kind of answer, is just like what kinds of power can possibly be marshaled to prevent countries from acting like this, from leasing parts of other countries or creating extra legal spaces in their own countries in order to evade legal and moral responsibilities. And I guess you could apply that to, obligations concerning asylum as easily as you could to fighting climate change.
Yeah, I think that partly as a result of climate change, the instinct to keep more and more people out of countries that are relatively safe and prosperous is just going to get more and stronger and stronger. And so currently, of all the people who are trying to move, I mean, most migration is internal, and same goes for climate migration. But there's still a lot of people who want to cross a border and go live somewhere else. Most of these people can't do that. And many of the ones that make it get sent away, and many of the people who try to go are thwarted before they can even leave their country or get to where they're trying to go. So the EU's externalization of its border by paying North African countries and Turkey, that's an example of that. And I think we're going to see lots of it. I don't think there has been any attempt to thwart it. If anything, it just keeps going, it keeps increasing. So I mean, this is a little harebrained, right? But if we take the logic of the special economic zone and instead of applying it to capital and the private private sector, you say, okay, we're going to have this zone and we're going to establish a place where it's like a halfway house. Like you can't come into our country, but you can go there. And again, this is really dicey, right? Because you could argue that a Manus Island or a Nauru is just that. But Australia excised parts of its territory and leased out other territories with with plans to detain people, right? These were prisons. And so what if we had spaces that were apart and again, like politically palatable to these like frankly horrible nationalists who want to keep people out, but they're still safe and people can live there and they're not in the same amount of danger. I mean, what if that's the way to think about it? Because I guess when I was writing my first book 10 years ago, I it seemed like we could get somewhere with more open borders. And now it doesn't seem that way to me at all. That's just what happened in the world in the past decade.
Mm,
So and so I guess this is defeatist in a way because maybe I'm a little bit defeated, but I think we need to start thinking beyond traditional nation states just to have places where people can be safe.
sure. And that
And
actually, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
yeah, no,
interrupt you.
fine.
It leads us into another audience question from Anonymous, which yeah is kind of related to what you're talking about, which is can extraterritorial spaces be used for positive purposes? So
Yeah,
presumably they don't think that tax dodging is a positive purpose, which some of us might think, but
it's funny.
other purposes.
This is a little digression, but I did a podcast. I did the Odd Lots podcast as finance stuff in Bloomberg. And one of the comments was, I'm fine with tax evasion, but I'm really offended by people locking up their Picassos. All right. So everyone has a line.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, unless you're really, really precious and hidebound about this idea that like land is inextricable with a whole slew of things like laws and national identity. And if you have this extremely rigid view, unless you have this very rigid view of what a nation state is and can do, um, I think we must try to think of extraterritorial space with as much creativity and as much potential as states themselves. So I think I say this in the book a few times. There's more of these zones than there are countries. Like the countries are the weird parts. These zones have existed forever in different ways. They're probably going to continue existing for a very long time. And if we don't want them to just be tax havens and detention camps, I think first of all we have to see them, right? We have to understand how they work. And then on whatever national, multinational, international level, try to make something better out of them because increasingly it seems like that could be the site of like some progress.
Mm, yeah. And I think also your point is a good one that maybe we're not trained to think of all zones as zones, but nature reserves and national parks are zones of exception where there might be not be private ownership and where certain laws of exception apply. Antarctica, another space where we
Yeah,
have a kind of non-nation state ontology, whole that sort of wields power there. Um,
exactly.
yeah, and actually, I say Antarctica just because it came to mind, but the book ends in Svalbard, an island, a Norwegian island, kind of off the coast of Norway, and I have to say I'm really unhappy about this ending. I could even say I'm angry about it because my book In Progress, which has bears some similarities to yours, also ends in Norway, not in Svalbard, but in the Arctic Circle in Norway. And I feel like you've taken a lot of wind out of my sails. But that's we can talk about that off chat.
We're all just riding on Frankenstein's wind, right?
That's
That's
right. Yeah, it has this beautiful circularity of opening in Geneva, where near where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, ending in the Arctic, where the monster where the book ends. I guess I shouldn't spoil it if anyone hasn't read it. But why did you end the book there? The book actually ends with a couple maybe more travelogue type chapters, and then the last one is in Svalbard. And yeah, what made that feel like the correct ending other than Frankenstein?
Actually, it was Frankenstein. It felt like a conclusion where you start in Geneva and you end there. It,
Mm.
it was also yeah, why do we end books the way we do? It felt like in the Svalbard chapter, so Svalbard is a place where it belongs to Norway. Norway is the sovereign, right? No one's contesting this. But for the past 100 years, it's had a very curious stipulation that anyone is allowed to live there. Like they can't discriminate against people there on the basis of nationality, which makes it the closest to a free zone for people that we have in the world today. Um, and I initially thought that this was like a quirk of interwar internationalism, right? The treaty was signed after the First World War. And then I started looking into the history and I went to I do very little work in archives. This was the rare archival research I did. And I found that to make a very long story short, and you should read the book if you want the whole story, the reason that one of the forces that made Svalbard this haven was not a bunch of crunchy or like utopian people in Paris in 1918, but a coal miner from Michigan and his lobbyist. And they were they were really, when Norway was given Svalbard, they were very concerned about their property. Again, we're back to property rights here. Who recognizes them? Who enforces them? And they seem to think that if there was a sort of stipulation protecting foreigners, then they would be able to maintain ownership of their coal mines. They ended up selling them. It didn't end up affecting them the way that they thought. But that was one of the reasons that Svalbard ended up the way it was. And to me, like, yeah, it's like a little depressing, right? There weren't these wonderful internationalists trying to make a free place for people. But out of these really mercenary interests, you do produce something that's somewhat good. And I think that's where we are today. Like we have all of these like lobbyists and businessmen and coal interests, just like awful stuff, right? To me.
Hmm.
Maybe not motivated by altruism and, for the benefit of humanity. At least we can say that. But maybe out of these tensions and conflicts, and maybe we can find some holes to poke and some space to use and to reclaim. Um, is it likely? I don't know. But to me, that seemed like a good place to end the book that actually isn't arguing that all of these places are bad.
Um, I think this will be maybe our last question. We have about 5 minutes left. Just a reminder to please buy the book. You can do so by clicking the button on the page that you're on right now. Um, and I'm curious if there were any zones or extraterritorial spaces that, for one reason or another, did not end up in the book. Any things on the cutting room floor, or I also know you wrote this over COVID, and you kind of miraculously got a lot of travel done in the intervening years, regardless. But I have to imagine it did change the structure of the book or change the nature of reporting in the book such that maybe there were things you had to leave out or had to treat differently.
I was gonna do a chapter on instead of the Dubai chapter is about the startup court in Dubai it's separate from the rest of the legal system of the country. I was initially going to do this chapter, similar themes but different place. I was going to write it about Singapore and Singapore's efforts to become the bankruptcy capital of the world, which sounds really bad, but actually is like yet another way to attract business. Because like think
Mm,
most business fails if it's easy to go bankrupt, so you don't get too screwed. It's a good place to go to start a business, right?
mm.
With the worst in mind. So that was something I didn't pursue, but I thought about. And I saw these images of all the, just like heaps of fast fashion discards in the Atacama Desert, and it turns out that that is also in a special economic zone. I couldn't go there, and I didn't really get much further than gawking at the photos, but that was one that I wish I was able to look into a little more.
These are places where unused clothing or unwanted fast fashion clothing gets dumped, basically, to.
It just
return to nature.
a powerful, um, almost circular depiction of the fact that
Mm.
many of these clothes get made in these special economic zones, and so they go to die too. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we can end it there in the desert with the mountains of old H&M shirts. Thank you so much, Atusa, for sharing some of the process of writing this book, The Hidden Globe, out now. Thanks for answering questions, and thanks also to New America for hosting this event.
Thank you, Ben. You were great, great interviewer. I appreciate it.